dog universe, something that can bring the world to its knees and worship me. How shall you accomplish that, almighty, stupendous, and terrific one? I'm thinking about it. Just give me time, and I'll reveal my power. My power. How to do it without changing time is maddening me, though, hissed the mutant. The black mutant walked over to his organ and began pounding out loud Bach-like music to help get rid of his built-up frustrations. While the black mutant pounded out across space near the planet Jupiter, Mutini was drifting lifelessly. On board, Newton was floating about through an atmosphere-less generator room. Newton floated over to the ruined, burned-out control panels in the generator room and began pressing buttons and turning switches. The generator in Mutania began to warm up. A dial on one of the control panels showed the amount of energy that was beginning to be generated to the engine room. Newton floated over to the control panel that had the overload button and began pressing buttons to it. The dial on the energy level showed that the energy was beginning to reach the critical level. Newton was setting Mutania up for a fiery, suicidal destruction. Since the death of his ship and crew, life had become unbearable for Newton. Newton's only wish now was to end it all. He didn't even care if the black mutant reached Earth and changed time. For him, everything was totally absurd and meaningless. Newton had almost all of the ship's energy absorbed into the ship's generator overload system. The only part of the ship that still contained energy were the ship's computer and transporter systems. Right as Newton had his finger over the button to transport all the ship's energy into the overload device, Newton suddenly realized that the computer was in perfect working order. It still contained all the information about his crew. Finding this out gave Newton a glimmer of hope. He had never tried this before, but the idea of the transporter being hooked up to the computer and bringing his crew back to life quickly made Newton shut down the ship's destruct device. Newton quickly went to work hooking the main computer up to the transporter system. Newton then placed the dead, frozen Doug Davis onto the transporter plates after dressing him up in a spacesuit that was producing oxygen. Then with excited, hopeful anticipation, Newton flew over to the transporter control panel. He pressed a button, then pulled down a switch. The dead Doug Davis glowed brightly, then disappeared after being absorbed into the transporter. Newton then crossed his fingers and prayed for a miracle. He then pushed up the switch. Newton watched intently with great excitement as the transporter plates produced another bright flash of light. Suddenly, to Newton's shocked, horrified mind, Doug Davis reappeared, not in the form of himself at all, but as a red, pulsating blob of blood and flesh. Newton almost fainted from the grotesqueness of it. "No," he said, about to vomit. "Hoo-oo-oo-oo, hoo-oo-oo," the blob of Doug Davis whined in a mutated agony. Newton quickly pressed the button and pulled down the switch again. The blob of protoplasma quickly vanished into thin air. Newton was left with a shocked, sickened expression on his face. Thinking about what he had just witnessed made him almost dry heave. He became excited that the blob was alive, but was horror-struck with the notion that his crew wouldn't be able to be brought back without being severely deformed. Suddenly, Newton got the idea that the transporter wasn't completely hooked up to the transporter very well, and that the computer was responsible for Davis's deformity. Newton quickly went to see, and sure enough, he was right. After reworking the wiring, Newton tried again. The transporter plates lit up again. A few seconds later, Doug Davis is standing in perfect shape on the transporter plates. "Thank God," said Newton. Doug Davis blinked his eyes and said through the communication device on the space helmet, "Newton, what am I doing here? Did the Black Mutant leave? I could have sworn that I was dead and traveling through a tunnel in space." "Are you saying that to make me happy and hopeful in the hereafter?" asked Newton. "I don't know what I'm saying. I take it that Mutania is destroyed, except for the transporter and computer?" "Yes." "I was really dead, wasn't I?" "Yes." Huh, that's funny. It's the first time that I can recall being really truly dead. I take it everyone else died also, right?" "Yes." "Thank God for a computer and transporter. If they had burned out, or if the memories of how I was were burned out, man, Newton, I would still be dead," said frightened Doug Davis. Newton then walked up to Doug Davis, shook his hand, and said, "Let's bring back the others. The ship needs repairing." "And then what?" asked Doug Davis. "Then we are going to teach that yellow-eyed piece of tar what happened when he come. Oh, then we're going to teach that yellow-eyed piece of tar what happens when he comes close to killing the crew of Mutania," said a furious Newton. And while Newton was restoring the life back to his crew, the Black Mutant was getting some ideas on how to take control of the Earth. The Black Mutant sat in his throne and said, "My crew, I'm going to do a little experimentation. I'm going to start manipulating the people of Earth and see what happens, what effect it has on me. If nothing happens, I shall increase my name, my hand in the affairs of the 20th century. If I see no change at all, then, haha, it's gangbusters time. I will soon be known as a god of the 20th century. Ha ha ha. I will be the greatest of all time, and no Newton or Federation will ever be around to stop me." "What are your plans, almighty, powerful, and godly one?" asked the robot at the Black Mutant sensors. Asked the robot at Black Tania sensors. "Scan the northern Atlantic for a United States submarine. I want to make K-39 a submarine captain. I want him to be captain of the sub with the most nuclear missiles," hissed the Black Mutant as he showed his black teeth. "Why?" asked the robot. The Black Mutant threw a brick at it, knocking its head to the side, but not damaging it. "I want to teach those Soviets a lesson in manners. Something tells me that they aren't going to enjoy my desire to put them in gulags," laughed the Black Mutant. "Why?" asked another robot. The Black Mutant walked over to his throne, picked up another brick, and threw it at the one that asked the question. The robot ducked, making the mutant miss. The robot made a laughing sound. The Black Mutant quickly grabbed it and started pounding it in the face, saying, "Because I hate those who think they're tough. That's why," said the Black Mutant, pounding his fist into the robot's face on each word. A few hours later, down in the northern Atlantic above Greenland, the crew of a USS Polaris sub carrying a lot of apocalyptic missiles became puzzled to a loud buzzing sound that started at the back of the sub's propeller and began moving toward the bridge. "What's going on here, Captain?" asked the concerned crewman. "Do you think the Soviets are up to something? Something so advanced that we can't put our finger on it?" asked the concerned lieutenant. The captain looked worried. "Where is the vibration in the ship now?" Where is the vibration in the ship now? Is it closer to us now?" "Yes, sir. It's now 10 feet from the bridge and closing." The bridge of the Polaris began to be filled with a loud buzzing hum. "Where is it coming from?" shouted the captain. "Is there another sub out there that we can't see?" "Sir," said the lieutenant, "you're not going to believe this, but the sound seems to be produced from a beam of energy directly overhead." "You mean from a boat? But how can that be? There's no boat above us." The bridge of the Polaris sub began to hum loudly. Everyone nervously looked about, not knowing what to do or think about it. "This is creepy, sir. Really creepy. The beam is directly overhead." "Where overhead?" shouted the captain. "Over your head, sir," the puzzled lieutenant said. The sound began to change in frequency. Suddenly the captain blacked out and fell to the floor unconscious after yelling out in pain, making his crew jump to see if they could help him. When they reached him, the sound quickly faded out and was gone. "Weird. Really, really strange," said one of the crew as the captain quickly regained consciousness with the fading sound. In the White House, President Wilson was called up on the phone by the captain. "What is it, Captain Lowry?" "Oh, what is it, Captain Lowry?" asked President Wilson. Captain Lowry began telling him, "Mr. President, what if the Soviets are testing us with a new weapon? What then?" "I'll think of something," said Wilson in a quavery, frightened, wimpy voice. This next story I'm about to read to you, which I began writing February 2nd, 1987, almost 4 years ago. Almost 4 years ago. It is called Experimentation on Kindly President R.M. Wilson. Began writing February 2nd, 1987, almost 4 years ago. It is called Experimentation on Kindly President R.M. Wilson. Robert N. Wilson. Out in orbit, around Earth, Black Taney began scanning the North Atlantic, worrying the crew of the submarine again. On Black Taney, the Black Mutant sat in his throne, smiling excitedly, realizing that he was realizing what he was hoping to do. "Do you have enough information on the captain of the Polaris to make K-39 his replacement?" "Everything on Captain Lowry has been complete, almighty, powerful, wondrous, and godly one," said Robot of the Sensors. "Good. When Captain Lowry is by himself, prepare the transporter to absorb him into the computer. Then, on my command, transport K-39 into a deserted part of the submarine. After this, I'll be owning a 20th century nuclear submarine all of my own." And down in the submarine, the captain of the Polaris found himself pacing back and forth on the bridge, worrying about the scanning beam that had invaded his vessel twice now. Everyone was confused as to what it could be coming from. Could it have been from a Russian ship, Captain?" asked the lieutenant. "I mean, it seems to be coming from... Could be from a Russian satellite, Captain. Said a lieutenant. It seems to be coming from space. But our government is scanning the area where the beam is said to be where the beam is coming from, and so far it seems to be coming from nowhere, like it's coming from another dimension," shouted the captain. And on Blacktania, a robot looked at the mutant and said, We have our transporter beam pointed at Captain Lowry, my mighty, powerful, stupendous, and great one." The black mutant looked a little nervous, a little uneasy, and said, "This is exciting and scary. It will be interesting to see if this affects me. Will this change history?" A robot suddenly reported, "Almighty, terrific, godly, and unbeatable one. The captain of the Polaris submarine has just entered his private quarters. He is in the part of the submarine where you want him." The black mutant smiled evilly and called Blacktania's transporter room, telling the robot of the transporter room to place key 39 on the transporter plates. "Prepare the transporter to absorb Captain Lowry." "Transporter is activated, Mighty One." "Absorb," said the black mutant. And in the Polaris, the captain was getting ready today on his bed was going to lay down on his bed to rest, when suddenly his room began to be filled with a loud vibration. The captain looked about with terror, then grabbed at his head with great agony. He stumbled about the room and began to try to leave his room. Captain Lowry gave out a yell of agony, then suddenly his whole body began to shrink and crumple up. He fell to the floor of his room and disintegrated within seconds. Right as his lieutenant entered his room, he found not a trace of Captain Lowry. Seeing that Captain Lowry was gone, his crew began to search the ship. While everyone was searching high and low, calling out for the captain, the late Captain Lowry's room lit up brightly. The bright light from the room made his crew run inside it, and there, right before their eyes, stood what appeared to be their beloved Captain Lowry, the robot replica, the robot duplicate. The robot replica smiled and said, "I fooled you, didn't I?" "Why did you do that?" asked the lieutenant. "All this secret scanning got to me." "Where did you hide off to?" "I was hiding under my bed. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." And with that, the robot ordered them to their posts. Back on Blacktania, the Black Mutant jumped for joy to realize that he was still king of Blacktania. No history was changed by killing a captain of a USS submarine in the late 20th century. The Black Mutant jumped about in his throne with great excitement, shouting, "This is terrific! I'm still here, even after the disintegration and replacement of Captain Stephen Lowry. Ha ha ha! I guess he died before the war with Russia in the 21st century." "What are you going to do now?" asked the sensors robot. The Black Mutant threw a brick at the robot, screaming, "Don't ask questions." "What am I going to do now?" "Remember what we did with the Polaris? Well, now, direct the beam at Washington, D.C. I want to see what I can do to the U.S. President. Who knows what may happen now if I manipulate Mr. Pennywaist Wilson. Out of all the presidents America produced, Wilson was always the one with the least backbone. I would like to see what happens to us when I get rid of some of his wimpiness. Haha. I hated the way the Soviets took advantage of my ancestors because of this puppet pipsqueak. K32. Direct the beam at the White House. I want to see the wimp on my viewing screen. Now. A few minutes later, down in the White House, President Wilson was talking with the Prime Minister from Russia when the scanning beam from Blacktania entered the room and began scanning him. A crowd of reporters walked out the door for the president's words on the outcome of the presidential of the president's decision on his latest arm control talk with the Prime Minister of Russia. The beam caused a low vibrating hum that made it possible to see what they were talking about for Blacktania. In the Oval Office, the Prime Minister of Russia, unaware of the low hum around him, said to President Wilson, "Mr. President, you have misunderstood what I wanted. I told you to have 500 more of your ICBMs disassembled by last Sunday. You only have 400 disassembled. For that, we will invade all of West Germany and kill your soldiers. You aren't doing what we want fast enough," shouted the big, ugly Russian Prime Minister, spitting in the face of the frightened President Wilson. "But gee," gulped Wilson, "don't you see that you are showing aggression, making the world scared of you?" "Ha ha," laughed Borsky. "That makes me angry that you asked that. That makes me angry that you asked that." Borsky then slapped Wilson across the face. When the Black Mutant saw that, his eyes glowed orange with jealousy. He hit the edge of his throne with his fist, shouting, "I hate to see someone doing my job. I am going to be the terror of the universe, not Russia." The mutant looked over at a robot who was standing at a very special device of the bridge. The Black Mutant smiled and said, "K1, activate the mind control beam that Industrial used to control me with. Direct it at President Wilson. Make him say the words, 'You play roughly, Borsky.'" And on the Earth in the White House, President Wilson suddenly felt strange. He blinked his eyes and he spilled the Stolichnaya vodka Borsky brought him to control him. "What is your problem?" asked Borsky. Suddenly the room began to hum a little, making Borsky look around. President Wilson got a blank look on his face and said, "You play roughly, Borsky." "What you mean, play roughly?" The president didn't answer him, but just stared straight ahead. He suddenly blinked his eyes and said, "What are you doing staring at me like that, sir?" asked the whippy Wilson. On Blacktania, the Black Mutant was jumping up and down with glee that Industrio's mind control beam could control a world leader so well. "Wow! Now," said the mutant. "Now," said the mutant, when Borsky threatened. Now, said the mutant, when Borsky threatened the faggot. "Now," said the mutant, "when Borsky threatens the faggot again, make him say in a snooty, unflinching manner, 'Is that so?'" And down in the Oval Office, Borsky slapped Wilson across the face.